Yes, this is a story about the kind of knock-on effect from the decision to close schools and cancel exams, primarily during the pandemic. So a lot of university leaders are pointing out that because of that grade inflation that we saw in 2021 in particular, points out such a striking statistic, but 44.8% of all A-level grades were A or A stars in 2021 because there was this reversion back. 44.8%. Because of the fact that we all remember the algorithm which went horrendously wrong, one of Gavin Williamson's exploits, and then they had to kind of revert back to teacher-assessed grades, which for obvious reasons were quite a lot more generous. And whilst you obviously wouldn't begrudge the teachers of that, it obviously has these knock-on effects. So first of all, there was this scramble to actually find university places for people, given the knock-on effects of that, but also students are showing up at often top-flight universities just not kind of necessarily ready for it. And this is always a problem when you kind of push people into kind of those educational settings without actually having met the sort of requirements, if you like, formally, or they've met them formally but not actually education, is that you often get people dropping out, falling behind. It doesn't really work. So this is another thing that we're still sort of reckoning with. The grade inflation has come down as of last year. I think it went down to about 36.4% was A and A stars, but that's still at a very high level. And it's just a reminder of all of the kind of unintended consequences of a lot of the decisions that were made. And I think there's always going to be a very embittered, in some cases, debate about the lockdown measures. But I do hope going forward that the schools part of this and the exams part of this will be recognised as a mistake that we should have caught very early on. Because even when, during the period of the first lockdown, it became quite clear from countries that hadn't closed schools. Even I think in Sweden there was a study that came out comparing it to its neighbours that had closed their schools. In Sweden they only closed the sixth forms essentially, that it hadn't really made any impact in relation to spread.
And always talks about Sweden.
Exactly, but that was the sort of thing where even relatively early on it was quite clear that the schools part of this was most likely a mistake. And I think at least our bar for when we decided to do things like cancel exams should have been higher than probably it was. But of course in that moment of panic a lot of those things go out the window, don't they?
But also, these students are going to be ill-prepared for exams, aren't they? Because some of them have not sat an exam in school due to lockdowns. They just did coursework, and it was a teacher assessment that got them through to university. They won't be prepared for that kind of assessment process once they're there, will they?
And the issue is, as well, is that this kind of is an extra layer on top of what was already going on, because grade inflation has been something that's been talked about for a fair amount of time. And there is this issue where you do have some students showing up at university where, particularly if they end up getting into top-flight universities, where because the education they might have received was not kind of sufficient, they might have got the grades but not the education, if you like, that they do end up struggling, falling behind. There's often been kind of anecdotes of having to put on kind of more remedial courses and things for new entrants. And it's just not a good system to be in. It's not a knock on the teachers, it's not a knock on the individual students, but when the education system fails in that sense, you can set up even quite bright young kids for failure because they're just not prepared for that institution that they end up in at the end of it.
But I do think there's responsibility on the university's part to sort of take their share of the job of helping these young people get up to speed so that they can make the most of those educational opportunities and the kind of world of work and opportunities beyond there. Because we can't just kind of throw our hands up and go, oh, well, that's the lost generation. They didn't get the education they needed. They've got these kind of slightly dubious grades. We owe them, as a society, we owe them a responsibility to make sure that COVID doesn't impact their life chances for the rest of their lives. I think universities should put on remedial courses and study support and all that stuff. I guess
the point was they were doing that even before the pandemic in certain cases, and it's just the way in which this has sort of accelerated a lot of problems. And we're talking about university entrance here, but at the bottom end of the scale, you've got all of those children who just never returned to school, the so-called ghost children, who have just fallen off the educational map entirely. And
they're measured in thousands, aren't they?
Exactly. Just haven't returned back. And that's not only that's an educational horror, but it's also a safeguarding problem as well. So all of these things will be reckoning with for years to come.